Hey, deserving listeners. This episode is a deep dive on narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. I recently sent out a survey to all my patrons on Patreon, asking them what sort of deep dives they wanted me to do, and narcissistic personality disorder was the clear winner. So, this is for all of you patrons. I've been wanting to do a deep dive on narcissism for years. I even bought a number of books years ago just for this episode, and I've been compiling research and whatnot, but other things have taken priority, other deep dives, other professional endeavors. Also, I knew that this episode would possibly be one of the most, if not the most involved episodes I've ever done before. And it was always scary to me. I would see it on my list of episodes to do, and I'd be like, "Oh boy, that's going to be like 2 or 3 months of research and note taking and thinking and talking and blah blah blahing." So it was, but I finally have time to do it now. So and the patrons motivated me by voting for this as their most preferred deep dive. And this episode is going to be a long one. I have several pages of notes. I have 55 pages of notes. My God. Based on other episodes with page length, I'm guessing that this episode's going to be 4 hours long, maybe 5, maybe more than 5 hours long. I don't know. There's just so much to talk about, you know? What is narcissism? What's the history going back to Freud and before Freud? Are we becoming more narcissistic as a society? Are there movies that depict narcissism well? Does Trump have narcissistic personality disorder? What about Facebook and social media and taking selfies? Does that indicate narcissism? How do we treat narcissistic personality disorder? What's the conceptualization of it? Is it even treatable to begin with? And there's really just so much bad information about narcissism on the internet. I couldn't find a single resource that explained narcissistic personality disorder well enough for me to hold something up and say, like, this is what you need to read in order to really get narcissism. I just could not find that. I mean, there was one resource that there were a couple of resources that I liked. There was one video that I saw on YouTube that I saw in all my research over the past number of months, and I just recently tried to find it again, and I couldn't find it. Basically, if you search on YouTube, it's like a drawing or cartoon, essentially, while someone's explaining it, and there's someone standing on a stage, and they're trying to hide their broken down house by showing a picture of a beautiful house. I don't know. Anyway, I couldn't find it, but I remember thinking, yeah, that's a pretty good explanation. You know, I've looked at hundreds of sources, and the sources are either super simplistic, which seemingly results in a lot of people completely misunderstanding the point of narcissistic personality disorder. And this is similar to any personality disorder. You know, borderline is massively misunderstood in our society, and I've talked about that before. If it wasn't super simplistic, it was a journalist just talking out of their ass. It is amazing how many journalists think that they understand narcissistic personality disorder. It's laughable. You know, I mean, it's laughable how lay people think they understand these sorts of things without any training. And I'll get into some of the research in a second. And then if I did find a reputable source, the source was super confusing and jargony, and to me still didn't really capture my experience with the disorder. So the other source that I liked, in addition to that one video I can't remember and can't find, but can describe, is Otto Kernberg actually has some short YouTube videos that are great. Otto Kernberg has the most, I think, relevant explanation and conceptualization of narcissism. But his videos are short, naturally, because he's being interviewed. But if you want to find something, go to Otto Kernberg on YouTube. I mean, I've heard respectable podcasts talk about narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder in a way that completely misses the point. There was one podcast that talked about how every young person suffers from narcissistic personality disorder, or like half of our society suffers from narcissistic personality disorder. Now, it'd be one thing if they said everyone's narcissistic. That's not a clinical claim, but they actually invoke the disorder. They actually invoke narcissistic personality disorder. And there was this one episode of this one podcast. That was the whole point of the podcast. And the whole time I'm just throwing my phone against the wall. I'm just like, how many lay people just stand up and start talking about some super technical cancer and or the inner workings of a cell as if they know, or DNA is this or that. Or, I can't even say the words because I'm not an expert. I imagine actually this does happen, and it probably does drive experts nuts. But anyway, it's ridiculous. And from what I understand, the vast majority of people who talk about narcissistic personality disorder on the internet do not understand it, which I get. Because in order to understand narcissistic personality disorder, you have to understand personality disorders in general, which is extremely difficult. You have to understand personality in general, which is really hard. You have to understand psychological development and attachment and the history of psychology and psychotherapy and psychiatry. You have to understand the nature of diagnosing, which is extremely elusive. You have to understand what it feels like to be with someone who has narcissistic personality disorder, and so on and so on and so on. It makes sense that no one gets it. What I don't get is that everyone doesn't realize they don't get it, and yet they talk about it anyway. Understanding personality disorders, understanding narcissistic personality disorder, these are not intuitive skills that you just acquire from life or from the internet. It takes years of study to understand personality disorders. And it takes years of working with people with narcissistic personality disorder. When I graduated with my degrees, I did not understand narcissistic personality disorder. Just because I had the education didn't mean I understood it. I had the criteria. I had been given some vignettes. I had written papers. I had watched videos. I had heard lectures and passed my classes, but I still didn't understand narcissistic personality disorder. In order to understand the disorder, you have to work with clients for years. And some individual clients, you have to work with them for at least 6 to 12 months just to get a vibe, an understanding of how their personality works and how they react to things and why, where it comes from. You match that up with your experience, and you match that up with consultation and reading and all that kind of stuff. And then you begin to kind of understand it. So it makes sense that, people don't really get it again, but why people think they get it is beyond me. And actually, research has looked into this. Research has shown that lay people have trouble understanding narcissistic personality disorder and personality disorders in general. For example, Frim and colleagues had a study in 2011. In that study, they presented some case vignettes of personality disorders to lay people. And they found that lay people had a hard time understanding personality disorders in general, and they had the hardest time identifying narcissistic personality disorder in the vignettes. Something like 4% of people got it right or something. It was some kind of really low rate, which actually surprises me because of all the personality disorders, I wouldn't think that narcissism would be the hardest one to understand, but apparently, according to this study, it was the hardest thing to understand. So again, not only were these people in this study, the lay people, having given the criteria, it's not like they just threw them in, they said, here's the criteria for this disorder, read this vignette and, identify what disorder is being displayed in this vignette. And the lay people had a really hard time with diagnosing personality disorders, which, doesn't surprise me, and particularly had a hard time with narcissistic personality disorder. Also, most clinicians don't understand narcissistic personality disorder. So why would lay people understand it? For example, one study found that 50% of patients with personality disorders who entered a hospital were misdiagnosed. They're often misdiagnosed with bipolar or major depression. I just want to emphasize this. So these are clinicians who went through graduate school of some level, have been supervised, have taken several classes on diagnosing, are considered to be experts and totally capable of diagnosing people, have resources, have consultants, have, and people who diagnose people in hospitals aren't typically just right out of graduate school. So these are presumably qualified individuals. And when someone comes into their office to be assessed who has a personality disorder, 50% of the time, those patients are misdiagnosed with something other than a personality disorder, often bipolar or major depression. Half of the time, qualified clinicians are misdiagnosing personality disorders as something else. Half of the time. So very few people on the planet understand narcissistic personality disorder and how to identify it, how to diagnose it. Even among clinicians, very, very few people get it. And I'm even guessing that this is just, I can't remember the exact methodology, but the study of the clinicians, I'm guessing that among all the clinicians in our country, that these clinicians at the hospital are among some of the best diagnosticians around because that's their job. There are people who work in private practice or in, say, family centers who aren't exposed to a lot of different kinds of diagnosing activities, and so their skills aren't as developed as someone who works in a hospital in an intake situation. So these people are, so if this was generalized or if the methodology included all clinicians in all settings, I'm guessing that percentage would go up much higher. 80, 90% of clinicians wouldn't be able to identify someone with a personality disorder or misdiagnose them. Now, this isn't to say that these clinicians are incompetent or something. The thing is that narcissistic personality disorder is extremely difficult to understand, especially in the short term. Like I've been saying, you have to work with someone for weeks, months before you can really narrow down the possibilities. I've worked with people with narcissistic personality disorder, and in the beginning, I was like, I have an hypothesis that this person suffers from narcissistic personality disorder, but I can't be for sure yet because I don't know. I haven't seen them react to enough situations. I don't know the transference, countertransference well enough yet. I haven't seen enough data. Maybe this is just this day, or maybe they just have some traits and not the full-blown disorder. I really have to observe and assess this person for weeks. When I have diagnosed people with narcissistic personality disorder, it is only after working with them for a minimum of, I'm going to guess, 3 months. And that's weekly sessions. And I am an expert on it. I'm an expert on treating it and on assessing for it. And still, it takes me 3 months to really be confident in that diagnosis. I could imagine it, but I'm not usually pressured in my private practice to diagnose. I could imagine if I was pressured to do it as fast as possible, I could probably do it in, 5 hours, depending on the situation. But, people with this disorder are often elusive and evasive. And so it would really depend on how compliant and how trusting the client was to me. Because if they weren't, then it would be really hard to figure out. So this is all to say that very few people on the planet understand narcissistic personality disorder and can diagnose it effectively and accurately. Very few people on the planet, very few clinicians can do it. And therefore, of course, lay people have trouble with this disorder. But again, it's mind-boggling that everyone is super confident on the internet that they know what it is and that they know that they can diagnose it. In this episode, I hope to actually do my little part to eliminate that confusion. We see it on the internet all the time. There's a huge trend for people to be labeled with narcissistic personality disorder. Of course, we know Trump is often identified, but Obama was identified. Maybe depending on the echo chamber you existed in, you either might be surprised by that or completely know that. If you're a Republican, you've probably read several psychologists diagnose Obama with narcissistic personality disorder. That was one of the main refrains of the right, was that Obama was in love with himself and had a Jesus complex or something like that. Hillary Clinton was diagnosed with NPD. Kanye West, Kim Kardashian, they all have, all you got to do is type in like famous people with narcissistic personality disorder, and you'll see these completely unfounded claims of several people. Now, what I'll say from all that is, I'm not saying they don't have narcissistic personality disorder. I'm just saying there's no way for you to know. You know, it'd be like saying Trump does or does not have cancer right now. Well, there's no way to know. You know, you would have to be his physician and run tests and whatnot. Like you just don't know. The other thing that I always talk about whenever we're talking about diagnosing in general is that narcissistic personality disorder, as the vast majority, if not all the labels and diagnoses in the DSM, are not measurable hard science things. You know, when you have a broken bone, you take an X-ray, you can see the fracture in the bone. When you have high blood pressure, you take a measurement from a whatever you call those things that measure your blood pressure. When you have too much, when you're vitamin D deficient in your blood, you take a reading and you have your answer. But when it comes to anxiety, depression, narcissistic personality disorder, there's not a numeric measure. It is based on self-report, it's based on observation, and it's based on opinion. And there's a lot of gray areas. Now, you'll find consensus like, 10 out of 10 clinicians have identified this person as suffering from major depressive disorder. So, you can find consensus, particularly when people present in these very quintessential ways. But when it comes to narcissistic personality disorder, or any personality disorder for that matter, you will find some clinicians having wildly different points of view. And therefore, what's the truth? If someone has a broken bone, their bone is either broken or not, right? There's this concrete proof and truth to it. But when it comes to these labels of diagnoses, it's hard to demonstrate with hard science what your opinion is. But anyway, so yeah, lots of famous people on the internet being diagnosed this way. Basically, the media seems to think that every celebrity is automatically a narcissist. Like they're Madonna, basically anyone who is huge and famous and, basically makes their living from being famous they automatically suffer from narcissistic personality disorder, because look at them. All they want to do is be in the limelight. And it's like, well, that's extremely simplistic. That's like saying anyone who's crying suffers from major depressive disorder. It's a sign, but many people cry and don't suffer from major depressive disorder. Many people end up becoming a celebrity and don't suffer from narcissistic personality disorder. Many people are interested in having a job in which it involves celebrity status, and many of those people, if not most, if not the vast majority, do not suffer from narcissistic personality disorder. Some of them might, but unless you are able to assess them effectively over the span of a couple months, there's no way for you to know. And the other thing that you see on the internet that is just totally laughable is whenever you look at narcissistic personality disorder articles or narcissism, you'll see they frequently will have some kind of picture of a young attractive woman taking a selfie, right? They'll have some young woman taking a selfie, and that is somehow equated with narcissistic personality disorder, or even just generally narcissism in general, which is super cliche, totally not accurate. Taking a selfie is not a sign that someone has narcissistic personality disorder. It's not even a sign that they have any narcissistic traits. It's just a sign of someone who wants to take a picture of themselves. And they're probably in a cultural group of people that like to do that sort of thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's not indication of any sort of pathology. And just because you're old and cranky and you don't ever take selfies of yourself, which is redundant to say selfies of yourself, doesn't give you the right to diagnose other people or judge others because of their behavior. I'm Asian, and a lot of Asians take selfies. So screw you if you think that that is some sort of indication of something wrong. Now, can it be a sign? Can it be a yellow flag, so to speak, or a minor red flag of narcissism? Yeah, absolutely could be. But again, it'd be like saying if someone's crying, they suffer from major depressive disorder. And it's just a gross misunderstanding of depression and of narcissism. Also in the media, it just seems like narcissistic personality disorder is used to label people that people just don't like. A politician that they don't like, a celebrity they don't like. Kim Kardashian, a lot of people like to bash on Kim Kardashian. And many articles claim that she had narcissistic personality disorder. Now, I'm not saying she doesn't, right? I don't know. But you would have to get a statement from a clinician who had properly assessed her over time. And I'm guessing that if Kim Kardashian ever did get assessed or did go to therapy, that she wouldn't consent to that person blabbing to the media. So we'll probably never know, really, if Kim Kardashian has the disorder. And, we'll just have to live with that terrible, that terrible notion that we just don't know. How about that? How about we just don't know? And I find it funny who the media or people on the internet decide to identify as a narcissist, right? Kim Kardashian is a narcissist, but Donald Glover, no one's claiming he's a narcissist. They're both celebrities who love fame, and they're both people who do a lot of things for fame. If you don't know who Donald Glover is, he's the guy who had the video "This Is America." He was on Community. He was a writer on some different shows. He's, we've talked about him before. He's a singer, rapper, actor, comedian, all around great, funny guy. But because the media loves him and he's generally loved and Kim Kardashian is generally hated, Kim has narcissistic personality disorder. Donald does not. The truth is, there's no evidence that either of them have narcissism. They're both making a living by creating content that people consume. It's literally their job to be a celebrity, and that doesn't mean either one of them have narcissistic personality disorder. If you want to say that Kim is narcissistic, that's fine. That's not a clinical statement. You're just using an adjective to describe a human being. But narcissistic personality disorder or being on the spectrum of narcissistic personality is completely different from just merely saying that someone appears arrogant to you. So that is different. So there's a big difference. So lay people and journalists out there, feel free to say that person is narcissistic in my opinion because of blah, 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 blah. Fine. That's it's a similar statement of saying like that person seems, that's not a good analogy. Anyway, when I see that, it doesn't bother me. But when people say narcissistic personality traits or narcissistic personality disorder in particular, then I'm like, whoa, you really, one, are talking out of your ass. And two, in a way, it's unethical, particularly to you clinicians out there to be throwing around disorders like that, which happens. There's plenty of people who are clinicians being interviewed on the media or just writing their own articles, blog posts, diagnosing people with various things, including narcissistic personality disorder, which is uncool. I've talked about diagnosing fictional characters before, but if I ever do talk about it, I have several caveats around, like, I have no idea, so there are people just flat out diagnosing Donald Trump and Obama and Clinton and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, again, just to remind you, there's research that demonstrates the vast majority of lay people do not understand what narcissistic personality disorder is, and they don't understand how to diagnose it. And in another study, people with narcissistic personality disorder and other personality disorders were misdiagnosed by qualified clinicians 50% of the time. So it's really hard to identify. So in this episode, I'm going to try to alleviate that problem. And I'm really going to try to explain what narcissistic personality is and what narcissistic personality disorder is, what it really is, what it looks like exactly, how to recognize it, where it comes from, what causes it. Again, this episode is likely to take 5+ hours. I'm just in the intro and I'm already a half an hour into this episode. So I can't imagine how long this episode's going to be. So again, I'm going to talk about the definition. I'm going to talk about the prevalence. What is it exactly? And I'm going to really try to convey what the disorder is. I'm going to really try to explain it from a number of angles, really try to get rid of the misconceptions and provide, because it's a complex thing. Again, in this episode, I'm kind of explaining personality in general and personality development in general. So it's going to take some time, but I think it's necessary to, if you really want to understand narcissistic personality disorder, I think you have to explain it from a lot of different angles, because there's just a ton of misconceptions about personality and narcissism, and because we have a hard time. Well, anyway, I'll get into it later. I'm also going to talk about what narcissistic personality disorder is not, because there's a lot of things that are associated with narcissistic personality that are not a part of it. What celebrities have it? Does Trump have narcissistic personality disorder? Does Obama? Do I have narcissistic? I'm going to talk about myself in this episode because I have some traits. I'm a podcaster, for example. I chose a job that involves me yammering into a microphone and asking other people to listen to me. That's a narcissistic task. And along those lines, I'm going to talk about the spectrum of narcissism and how there are much less problematic forms of narcissism, but there's still forms of narcissism and can bite people in the butt. I'm going to talk about what the media are saying about narcissism. What does the research say? What's the history of the term and of the diagnosis going back to the 1800s? What does the DSM say? How can you detect narcissistic personality disorder in someone else? How do we treat it? That's very important, right? For you clinicians out there. Can we treat it, right? I'm going to talk about all that stuff. Movies. I've got 55 pages of notes and I'm on page 4. So mathematically this episode is 8 hours long going to be. Welcome to the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I am your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor and someone, I would say I'm about 5% on the spectrum of narcissistic personality, maybe 10. Not to brag, just joking. This episode is just for patrons of the podcast. So if you're listening to this and you're not a patron of the podcast, this episode will end before the content begins. If you want to hear the full episode, you have to become a patron of the podcast by going to patreon.com. So go to patreon.com, become a patron, and when you become a patron, you'll get access to this entire episode, along with hundreds of other deep dives that we've done that borderline personality example, histrionic personality, passive-aggressive personality. I've done deep dives on them. So, and dozens of others. So when you become a patron, just make sure you pay attention to the instructions on how to access the various different patron-only episodes. And remember that a portion of your monthly pledge goes towards various charities that we support.